Jesus speaks. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be made in you and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing. But I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you. And I appointed you to go and to bear fruit. Fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. I am giving you these commands, so that you may love one another. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So we're heading into stewardship season as we begin this month. And the funny thing is, that's always the time when people say, well, what we're talking about is stewardship and all the things in our lives, but really we know deep down that what they're talking about is how do we raise money for the next year's annual budget. We just don't want to put it that way. So over the last couple of months, members of the congregation, Presbytery as well, have run across someone who some of you already knew by the name of Eric Law. And he came and talked about this idea of holy currencies. Instead of just talking about money, but recognizing that there is God's abundance all around us. It's like the old story that the rabbis tell that we now know. Bruce Fiedler wrote a book called Walking the Ways of Moses. That's not the exact title, but I forgot to write it down, so I apologize. But if you look at it, he tells a story that when he went to walk through these ancient lands, that there's actually a caterpillar that lives in the desert that secretes this strange substance, and it almost like a flaky bread-like thing that tastes like honey in the wilderness. And the rabbis say that basically God was just telling Moses and the rest, by the way, it's all around you, there's food everywhere, you just have to eat it. The Hebrew slaves had never seen anything like this before, and they didn't realize that God was providing all around them, they just needed their eyes open. Likewise, the flight plan of the quail never quite made it into Egypt. So the Hebrew slaves didn't know what these birds were, and God says, you see this overabundance of birds that I'm going to choke you with? Because they're everywhere, you can eat them. There's sustenance all around you. So this is sort of the idea of this. But so let me tell you a little bit about Eric Law to bring you up to speed of why I think he's particularly important for our ministry at Westminster. He was a priest, he is a priest, Episcopal Church, and he was serving in a parish in Los Angeles during the uprisings in '92. He worked long in multiracial communities to work for respectful dialogue, for healing and healthy communities, figuring out ways to deal with the imbalances between cultures and the reality of white privilege and power. And over time, in the last few years, he's been going to a lot of missional conferences and sustainability conferences within the language of the church. In other words, how do we do new and exciting things was the sort of missional thing. How do we do things so radically different to reach folks who generally aren't going to show up on a Sunday morning, no matter what kind of music that you provide. And then, he would go and realize that most of these missional, exciting communities, and there's a lot of them, had a shelf life of about 2 years. They didn't last, even though they were doing amazing work. And then the conversations that we often talk about, the stewardship conferences or sustainable conferences, he would go, but he would not hear anything about interesting and amazing. It was sort of like these two groups felt like they couldn't talk to one another. And he said, somebody's got to do this. And so this is the passion of his life, is how does he help communities be both missional and sustainable? And the ways that he does this is to talk about this idea of currencies. On the front and the back of your bulletin, there's a great visual that he's created that talks about these 6 currencies and how they're interrelated together. We're not going to cover all those today. I'm not going to give you lots of definitions because your eyes are going to glaze over. But what I want to say this morning is we are in the adult Sunday school class now meeting downstairs on Sunday morning, digging in deeper on some of this stuff. And so what he recognized is that in healthy communities, all of these 6 things existed and they flow. In other words, what he says is that our ministry, our mission ought to be sort of like water. What happens when water gets stagnant and doesn't flow? That's when we have to worry about mosquitoes and rot and festering. Stuff grows in water that doesn't move. That all that we have is meant to be passed on to someone else. But also in communities to recognize that in the process of doing this, that there's more around us than we know. So you have this idea about the currency of relationships. I'm not going to talk about the others today. We'll work our ways through them. It's this idea of our relationship with one another. And at the retreat that we met with him, he invited a group of people, which I was part of, to come up and say, we want you as this group of 10 people. And it's always a dangerous thing when you get a group of people and to do this, and we didn't quite know what to do. And it worked, just like it worked here, right? And the way that it worked is that he said, I want you as this group to visually show us what a loving community looks like. And so this group of people, it's all in close together, and we're all hugging one another, right? All of our backs, we're all kind of in there together. I mean, some of us are probably thinking, I don't like to be touched. Can I get out of this quickly? A little self-revealing there. But here we were in this trying to visually show what a loving community looked like. And Eric Law asked the question, so if I'm an outsider, how do I get into this loving community? And we all went, oh, yeah, there's no way to get in. Because we're so closed in on ourselves. So he said, okay, then that's one of the problems sometimes, right? When church communities talk about being these loving and friendly places, and the reality is we're probably more like this. If you can get in, you can be loved, but getting in is awfully hard. And he said, okay, now I want you to do something else. The visual was this. I want you to visually show us a community that reaches out to around them. And so very quickly we figured it out. We grabbed hands and we stretched out as far as we could all across the room because we were going to be as open as we possibly could. And he said, well, what do you all notice? Well, one is our arms are tired. And the person on that end really has no connection with the center, which really isn't much left. So in other words, what had happened here is the community tried to be so outgiving that they forgot how to nurture themselves in the process. You can give, but if you give and give and give and never receive, you eventually die. And so he said, all right, so here's your third and final task. I want you to try to create a visual image of a way to have a community that's internally loving and sustaining, but also outwardly welcoming in a visual sense. And so the group came up with this idea of a spiral. So the outside of the spiral really wasn't all that far from the inside, but you could walk inside and out and move around. And it was this idea. He said, this is what we are talking about when it talks about missional and sustainable communities. We have to be open to the outside world around us, to nurture those kinds of relationships. And I'll talk about what that means in a minute. But also, we've got to make sure that we're nurturing ourselves. If you look at the image on the back of the bulletin, it has this image of internal and external relationships are necessary, not just for church communities, but healthy neighborhoods to survive. If you're in a healthy relationship in your community, you don't steal from your neighbors, you don't shoot one another. If there's healthy flow of relationships, healthy flow of currencies, there isn't a need for these things. And so it's a sign that we live in unhealthy communities. But the thing about relationships, and this is the piece I want to transition quickly, is this idea that they are mutually, this is his language that I'm using now, mutually respected connections. That's the hard part. What it means is that we have to be in relationship with one another in this group in a way that isn't smothering, in a way where there's just sharing of resources. And then externally, it's not just about, oh, how do we do a new mission project to drag people in and come serve on a committee? I know we don't think like that. So, but that happens places, right? Even in the back of our minds, we don't put that out there. We know that we're not supposed to say that. Those are the internal conversations that happen. But it's kind of what we do. And so what he talks about is this aspect of relationship, is about how do we form relationships when we're doing mission and ministry. Some of you probably know a guy by the name of John Bon Jovi. In my life, I have never, ever mentioned him in a sermon. Today I'm going to. So you might know his music, and I never really liked that. So when Eric Law brought up the story, I thought, I could check out here for a few minutes. But he developed this thing called Soul Kitchen. And this is a place in New Jersey where an old garage was converted into a community cafe that has a really amazing food and a chef. And so if you come in, they have this idea is if you're able to pay, then you pay. And if not, then you volunteer your time, either in the kitchen or in various places. And people do this. And in the process, chefs have donated time and they have trained people. And in this tiny little old garage that was a wasted space in New Jersey. And so his passion was how to do this. How do you create thriving communities in a place where there were not places where people could afford to eat? There are plenty of restaurants in St. Louis, some fascinating ones that have been formed in old garages, but if you don't have money, you are not eating there. And we have a city that has a lot of hunger and food insecurity. And so Jesus comes along in this and says, love one another like I have loved you. And a lot of times in the church we've argued about orthodoxy, but I think one of Westminster's favorite biblical stories is this idea, maybe because I've shoved it down your throat for 11 years, that might have something to do with it. I'll give you a moment on that. But the feeding of the fish and loaves, right? Particularly in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus gathers everybody together. I know I'm jumping out of the passage I read, but just go with me. It's illustrated. And at the end of the day, the disciples are exhausted, and they figured out that Jesus has done teaching, and they've been busy healing, and they think they've done what they're supposed to do. Now the people are hungry, right? So they've been taught, and they've been healed, but they're actually physically hungry. And the disciples do what they're supposed to do. We can't take care of these folks. It's just too much for us to do. Send them away. Jesus says, you do it. He's like, have you seen our budget? We don't have that. We can't tap any of our resources. We don't have any more money to serve these folks. And Jesus says, and y'all know the line, start with what you have. When he says you feed them, he asks the question. This is really what he says. What do you have? This goes back to the issue of abundance. The issue of manna around us. The quail that we didn't realize we could actually eat. And he says, you feed them. But start with what you have. And they're still baffled by this because they're thinking, we thought we got this covered. We did the teaching, we did the healing, now it's time for us to have our own time. And so now at this point, Jesus says, get them down in groups of 50s and 100s. And start with what you have. Now for those of you who've never heard my take on this before, when I was in Israel, our tour guide, who said that her family was in Magdala before Jesus ever showed up, so that gives you some idea about the length of her Christian roots, said no one at that time would have gone out into the wilderness without something in their pocket for themselves. Right? And so what it meant is that everybody there had something to share. But if they weren't in relationship with the people around them, there's no way they were going to share. And Jesus says, right? And Jesus says, get them in 50s, and then they start sharing around their group. And I'm convinced that at some point, the folks in the different go, oh look, they're sharing food over there. Well, I've got food here too. Let's put it out. The next thing you know, there's more food than anyone ever imagined, and there was leftovers. And Jesus says, don't waste any of that. Make sure we've got it because we'll need it again. They thought their job was to do orthodoxy, to have the right belief. We argue over these things. And in other words, I think what Jesus is saying in those moments is your job is to build community. How can it not be? When the rebels and the tax collectors, the ones who are trying to kill off the Roman Empire and those who are benefiting from it, show up together with Jesus at the table. He invites those folks to be in relationship, and they are natural sworn enemies, and they're called to be in relationship together. You can't have healthy and thriving church communities or neighborhoods when folks can't cross particular divides, whether it's mythical or real. You can't have healthy and thriving communities when 20 miles apart, if you live in North St. Louis, your average life expectancy is 67 years old. If you live in Clayton, it's 80. 20 miles apart. 18 miles apart, 18 years. Schools, health, all these things are part of what it means to be in healthy community. But if we don't have relationship with one another, we can just simply talk about those folks. Or those folks. And never figure out a way to break down the dividing walls of hostility. And this is where the mutually respectable relationships come into. And that's hard work. In 11 years, I'm convinced of one thing. In St. Louis, there's about 1 degree of separation in the white community and in the black community. What if that divide began to change before we can even get into the conversation about the fact that there's more than just white and black folk in this town? But we've never figured that out. And this is about the difficulty of that relationship. As we travel through this, and we'll continue to bring these things up, and you'll continue to be uncomfortable, and we'll mess things up, or at least I hope so on some level. We're going to talk about how each one of these currencies are interconnected. You cannot talk about them by themselves. They overflow. And the key for us as we're going through this, as I challenged the class this morning, is I want you to think about your own life right now. I asked them to do an exercise that I'm not going to ask you to do because that would drag things on, and I'm trying to wrap up, and I'm noticing from a few eyes that it's time to do that. Okay, his eyes perked up with it. Okay, is that I want you to think about 5 people who are not connected to this church. And if you're not in this church, if you're visiting from another church, 5 people, 5 relationships that you have that you would consider, now I really have attention, mutually respectful, and think about 5 people. And then think about the last few encounters you had with them, and think about the blessings that were exchanged in terms of knowledge and time and relationship building. Those are the kinds of things, and begin to recognize that you have this network of amazing people that may not be here. Now, the flip side is then to think about the folks in this room where we're really good sometimes at doing this, right? And we're better than that glob that existed at the conference. I want to say that. But think about inside, because you have to take care of both. 5 relationships that may be strained inside, or that are not as deep as you would like them to be, or in that way. And so as we're thinking about these, then we move to the next question and so I wonder, as we talk about this image of hoarding, if we're not letting the blessings flow, what kinds of relationships are we hoarding for ourselves? If you have in your own network, internally or externally, relationships with people that are really beneficial and blessings and otherwise, are you just keeping them to yourselves? Or figuring out a way to let that currency flow to others? I don't have an answer for that, but I do know this, that on this World Communion Sunday, when we gather together to break bread, that our family is way bigger than we can even imagine. Remember that on the night that Jesus was arrested, he gathered in the upper room with his disciples, and at that table were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, right? These were the revolutionaries. These were the folks who took the law into their own hands, probably ran the black market, and probably occasionally stabbed a few Roman soldiers and a tax collector or 2 in the back. Because, why? The tax collectors were getting rich on the backs of their own people. And Matthew was there at the table too. Now he stopped tax collecting, just like the zealots stopped stabbing in the back, and they were at the table with one another, sworn enemies. If those folks can figure this is what the table is about, it's about expanding and being nourished at the same time. It's that image of the swirl that says we nurture internally in our communities and in ourselves to reach out. Otherwise, we'll end up being completely dried out from pouring ourselves out. Or we'll be like the Dead Sea, that is dead because it just kept hoarding and it never gives out. You know, that's why the Dead Sea is dead, right? It never releases the water that it gets. It just takes and takes and takes and takes. And all the life in the Dead Sea is all but gone. That's what happens. So as we travel through this journey of stewardship, I really want you to be thinking about how your relationships can truly be an offering to God. How they can be given away, how they can be nurtured, how they can be shared, not just for ourselves, but how we can be part of the healing of our place in this area. And if you haven't read it yet, you need to sit down with the Ferguson Commission report, which I'll say more when we talk about the currency of truth, which is on that list too. It is my hope and prayer that you will take some time to inventory those relationships internally and externally, all for the glory of God.